The concrete bled heat, a constant oppressive thrum against the soles of worn boots, even through the thin fabric. Leo pressed his back to the rough wall, a futile attempt to disappear into the vast, echoing cavern of the main block. CECOT was a beast, its belly a labyrinth of steel and rebar, its breath the stench of fear, stale sweat, and something metallic, almost coppery. Overhead, the fluorescent lights hummed, casting a sickly yellow glow that never quite reached the darkest corners, leaving them to breathe their own shadows. Every sound was amplified, distorted, a symphony of suffering and suppressed rage. The distant clang of a metal door, the shuffling of hundreds of feet, the low growl of voices that never quite broke into full conversation, just the constant murmur of a trapped ocean. He had only been inside for 3 days, enough time to learn the rhythm of the place, the way the guards moved with an almost leisurely cruelty, the way the other inmates moved with a predatory grace. Survival here was a performance, a constant act of balancing invisibility with a manufactured strength. Leo knew he looked like fresh meat, his eyes still too wide, his movements too hesitant. He could feel their gazes, 1,000 tiny pinpricks on his skin, assessing, weighing, deciding. He was an anomaly, a man caught in the wrong place at the wrong time, now trapped in a world built for monsters. The tension was a physical presence, thick as the humid air, a coil tightening with every passing hour. He had heard the whispers, low and guttural, names like Mara Salvatrucha and Barrio 18, two leviathans battling for supremacy even within these impenetrable walls. Their territories were invisible lines drawn in blood and fear, respected by everyone who valued their life, even if only for another day. Leo had no gang, no affiliation, just a desperate, gnawing need to make it through, to see another sunrise, to somehow, impossibly, escape this living tomb. He had to learn quickly, to read the unspoken language of the yard, the cafeterias, the shadowed cells, or he would be just another statistic, another body claimed by the unforgiving maw of CECOT. A shiver, not from the heat, traced its way down his spine, a cold sensation that lingered even in the scorching air. It felt like something else was watching too, something older than the gangs, deeper than the concrete, a silent, patient observer in the prison's haunted depths. The choice arrived quickly, delivered not with a bang, but with a chilling, understated certainty. Leo was in the shower block, the lukewarm water doing little to wash away the omnipresent grime, when the two figures loomed, their shadows swallowing the already dim light. One was a hulking brute named Diablo, his face a roadmap of faded gang tattoos, his eyes flat and devoid of warmth. The other, a wiry man with an unnervingly calm demeanor, was known only as El Silencio. They were MS-13, a fact etched into their very presence, a silent declaration of ownership over this particular slice of hell. Diablo leaned against the rusted pipe, blocking the only exit. El Silencio stood closer, his voice a low rasp that somehow cut through the din of dripping water and distant shouts. "We hear you're new," he said, his words a statement, not a question. "No crew, no protection." Leo felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. He tried to project indifference, a strength he did not possess. "I'm just trying to serve my time," he replied, his voice betraying a slight tremor. El Silencio smiled, a flash of white teeth in the gloom, a smile that promised pain. "That's not how it works here, amigo. Not in CECOT." He paused, letting the words hang in the humid air. "You pick a side, or a side picks you. And when a side picks you, it's rarely good for your health." Diablo shifted, a low growl rumbling in his chest. "Barrio wants to talk to you too. Heard them whispering about fresh meat." Leo's mind raced. He knew the legends, the brutal, unending war between these two factions. To join one was to instantly become an enemy of the other, a target marked for death. To refuse both was an even swifter path to oblivion. He looked from Diablo's impassive face to El Silencio's unnervingly calm stare. The water continued to run, a monotonous, mocking soundtrack to his predicament. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about choosing his executioner. His life, what little remained of it in here, hinged on this very moment. A heavy silence descended, broken only by the rhythmic drip, drip, drip of the showerhead. He knew he had to speak, to make a decision that would define his remaining days, or perhaps end them. The air grew heavy, thick with unseen presences, a chill despite the warmth. He felt a profound sense of dread, a feeling that this choice would reverberate far beyond the prison walls. Leo's voice, when it finally came, was a dry, rasping sound. "What do you want from me?" he asked, directing the question at El Silencio, instinctively recognizing him as the mind behind Diablo's muscle. The wiry man's smile widened imperceptibly. "Just loyalty, nothing more. We heard you're smart, resourceful. That's a commodity in here." He gestured vaguely toward the teeming block beyond the showers. "Barrio, they only want bodies, numbers. We value intelligence." It was a lie, Leo knew, but it was a more palatable one than outright servitude. He thought of the alternative, the certainty of being caught between two warring factions, ground to dust. "Okay," Leo said, the word tasting like ash in his mouth. "I'm with you." Diablo grunted, a sound of approval. El Silencio nodded, a flicker of something almost like respect in his eyes. "Good choice. Now, let me tell you how things work around here." The education was brutal, swift, and comprehensive. The unwritten laws of CECOT were far more stringent than any official prison regulations. He learned about taxing, the forced protection payments from smaller, unaligned inmates. He learned about the pecking order, the subtle shifts in power, the unspoken cues that could mean the difference between life and death. He learned to identify the key players, not just within MS-13 and Barrio 18, but also among the corruptible guards who turned a blind eye for the right price. He learned that the official rules were a flimsy curtain, behind which a far more ancient, brutal code governed every interaction. But there was another layer, a chilling undercurrent that El Silencio only hinted at in hushed tones after dark, when the lights were out and the prison settled into a deceptive quiet. "This place," El Silencio had whispered one night, his voice barely audible. "It holds more than just us. There are old spirits here, Leo. They feed on the fear, on the hate. They watch. They wait." Leo had initially dismissed it as prison superstition, the ramblings of men driven mad by confinement. But then, he started to notice things. The inexplicable cold spots in the oppressive heat, the fleeting shadows that moved too fast to be real, the whispers that seemed to come from empty cells, always just beyond the range of understanding. The air in certain parts of the prison, especially the forgotten, dilapidated blocks, seemed thicker, heavier, charged with a malevolent energy. It wasn't just the smell of fear anymore, but the taste of something ancient and hungry, clinging to the very stone. He had stepped across a threshold, not just into a gang, but into a darker reality, a realm where the lines between the living and the dead blurred, and where survival might depend on understanding the supernatural as much as the criminal. He felt it watching him now, a cold, unseen presence, making the hairs on his arms prickle, a distinct unease settling deep within his bones. Leo's initiation into MS-13 was less about grand rituals and more about brutal, immediate tasks. He was tasked with surveillance, mapping the movements of Barrio 18 members, identifying their weak points, their informal meeting spots. It was a dangerous game, one that required a keen eye and a steel nerve. He walked the fine line, trying to appear innocuous while constantly observing, memorizing faces, patterns, the subtle shifts in gang dynamics. The cafeteria, the yard, the visitation room, every corner of CECOT became a chessboard where lives were the pieces. The first major confrontation came swiftly. A Barrio 18 member, a young man named Santos, with a perpetually nervous twitch, was caught trying to pass a message to an outside contact. MS-13 intercepted it, a coded note detailing a planned shakedown of the kitchen supplies, a lucrative racket they controlled. Diablo, with El Silencio's silent approval, decided Santos needed to be made an example of. Leo was ordered to participate in the interrogation, a euphemism for a savage beating in an isolated storage room, the kind of place where shouts would be absorbed by the thick concrete walls and ignored by complacent guards. He stood by, forcing himself to watch as Diablo and two others systematically broke Santos down, physically and mentally. The sounds were sickening, the smell of fear and blood potent. Leo felt a cold detachment settle over him, a defense mechanism he hadn't known he possessed. He was meant to deliver a few blows, a symbolic gesture of loyalty. When his turn came, his fist connected with Santos's jaw, a sickening crunch that resonated through his bones. It was a necessary evil, he told himself, a cost of staying alive. But a part of him recoiled, horrified by the monster he was becoming. That night, the whispers in the dark felt more insistent, more personal. He lay on his bunk, staring up at the peeling paint of the ceiling, unable to sleep. He saw Santos's broken face, heard his pained cries. Then, a new sound emerged from the darkness of the cell block, a faint, high-pitched scratching coming from the wall closest to him. It wasn't the sound of rats, he knew the difference. This was deliberate, rhythmic, almost like fingernails dragging across stone, spelling out an unknown message. He pressed his ear to the cold concrete, straining to hear. The scratching continued, forming a jagged pattern that seemed to pulse with a faint, internal light, a glow he could only perceive from the corner of his eye. Then, as suddenly as it began, it stopped. The air grew heavy, the cold spots intensified, and Leo felt a distinct impression, a whisper against his mind, of a presence that was both ancient and deeply malevolent, acknowledging his transgression, pulling him deeper into the prison's dark heart. He was no longer just a prisoner. He was a participant in something far more sinister than simple gang warfare. Leo's integration into MS-13, though forced, had given him a precarious foothold in the prison hierarchy. He was no longer completely invisible, nor was he entirely safe. The uneasy alliance with El Silencio and Diablo felt less like brotherhood and more like a leash, tightening or loosening at their whim. He had proven his utility, his willingness to follow orders, even barbaric ones, but he was always an outsider. His past a blank slate to them, his true motives a closed book. The rifts started to appear subtly, almost imperceptibly at first. Another new inmate arrived, a loud, swaggering man named Cortez, who quickly positioned himself close to Diablo, subtly undermining El Silencio's authority with casual remarks and an air of bravado. Leo observed the shifting dynamics, the way Diablo's gaze lingered on Cortez, the way El Silencio's silence grew colder, more cutting. It was a power struggle in miniature, mirroring the larger conflict with Barrio 18, a testament to the constant, corrosive nature of ambition within these walls. Leo found himself caught in the middle, his loyalty to El Silencio, however reluctant, now placing him at odds with Diablo's emerging favorite. Adding another layer of complexity were the guards. Warden Ramirez, a man whose smile never quite reached his eyes, began to implement stricter controls. Searches became more frequent, cell shakedowns more thorough, and the flow of contraband, the lifeblood of the gangs, began to dwindle. Whispers circulated that Ramirez was consolidating power, not just over the inmates, but over his own corrupt officers, cutting off their illicit income streams. This tightening grip created a new kind of pressure, a shared adversary that momentarily eclipsed the gang rivalry. But it also bred resentment, and desperate men made desperate choices. One evening, during a chaotic mess hall serving, a guard named Vargas, known for his brutality and his past willingness to accept bribes, cornered Leo. Vargas's eyes were bloodshot, his face flushed. "Heard you're El Silencio's new pet," Vargas sneered, his voice low and menacing. "Remember this, kid. There are more ways to die in here than just a shank, and sometimes the system itself decides when you've outlived your usefulness." He pushed Leo roughly, deliberately spilling a tray of food, creating a scene that drew glares from both MS-13 and Barrio 18 members, marking Leo as a target for a different kind of retribution. The threat was clear, unequivocal. He was not just battling other inmates, not just grappling with the sinister entity in the walls, but also fighting the very architecture of his incarceration, a system that could crush him at any moment, for any reason, or no reason at all. The air still felt heavy. The unseen presence seemed to relish this new level of despair, its cold breath a constant companion. The threat from Vargas, coupled with the escalating tension within MS-13, sharpened Leo's senses. He knew he was a pawn, but a pawn with a mind. And he began to seek information beyond the immediate needs of his forced allegiance. He started observing the guards more closely, noticing their shifts, their routines, their subtle tells. He paid attention to the older inmates, the ones who had been here for decades, their eyes holding histories the official records would never show. He learned that the official prison archives were housed in a rarely accessed, dilapidated wing, a place deemed too dangerous, too unstable for regular use. Driven by a strange intuition, a feeling that the answers to his increasingly complex predicament lay not just in the present but in the past, Leo began to discreetly probe. He managed to barter for a small, bent paperclip, a seemingly innocuous item that was a treasure in the confined world of CECOT. He chose a night during a particularly loud, boisterous football match on the yard's single television, knowing that most eyes and ears would be otherwise occupied. With the paperclip and a nerve-wracking patience, he bypassed a rusty lock on a forgotten storage closet, a closet rumored to connect to the older sections of the prison. He slipped through, the air immediately turning colder, thicker, smelling of dust, decay, and something else, something metallic and ancient. The single weak bulb in the closet barely illuminated a narrow, low-ceilinged passageway. He followed it, his heart pounding, a cold dread clinging to him. The passage led to a crumbling staircase, descending into absolute darkness. He used a stolen lighter, its flickering flame barely pushing back the oppressive gloom. At the bottom, a vast, derelict archive stretched before him, rows of rusted metal shelves groaning under the weight of forgotten files, boxes, and ledger books. The sheer volume was overwhelming. But then he saw it, a series of thick, leather-bound journals, clearly much older than the surrounding paper files, tucked away in a corner, almost hidden. The spines were brittle, the pages yellowed. He pulled one out, its weight surprising him. The first entry was dated almost a century ago, a warden's meticulous, almost obsessive chronicle of the prison's early days. The writing was faded, but legible. As he read, a chilling narrative unfolded, not of inmate history, but of something far more unsettling. The warden described strange occurrences, unexplained deaths, the rapid mental decay of guards and prisoners alike, all attributed to the entity, a malevolent spirit, a force that permeated the very stone of the prison. The journal detailed attempts to contain it, rituals performed by local shamans, all failures. The entity, it claimed, grew stronger with each act of violence, each despairing soul. Leo flipped through the pages, his breath catching in his throat. He found sketches, crude but disturbing, depicting grotesque, shadowy figures, and then a map, meticulously drawn, outlining a network of forgotten tunnels beneath the main block, connecting directly to the oldest, deepest parts of the prison, the very foundations. It mentioned a heart chamber, a place of ritual, a source of the entity's power. This wasn't just gang warfare. This wasn't just corrupt guards. This was an ancient evil, a literal demon feeding on the chaos and violence. His personal struggle for survival had just intersected with a terrifying, supernatural war. The air grew colder, and he felt a distinct hum, a vibration from deep beneath his feet, as if the prison itself had acknowledged his discovery, a new player in its horrific game. His strategy had to change, drastically, if he was to have any hope of survival. The whispers now seemed to take on a more deliberate, menacing tone, no longer just random, but directed, focusing on him. The weight of the journal felt like lead in Leo's hands, the knowledge contained within it, a burning brand on his soul. He had to get out, he had to tell someone, but who in this place would believe him, and who could he trust? He carefully replaced the journal, making sure everything appeared untouched, then retraced his steps, the return journey feeling infinitely longer, the shadows more menacing, the whispers more palpable. He slipped back into his cell block, his heart still thrumming a frantic rhythm. The next morning, the betrayal struck, swift and sharp. Leo was called by El Silencio, a rare private summons to a small, isolated room used for storage. El Silencio's face was grim, his usual calm replaced by a cold fury. "Diablo wants to talk to you," he stated, his voice devoid of its usual inflection. "He says you've been asking too many questions, poking around where you don't belong." Leo's blood ran cold. He knew El Silencio had always been suspicious of him, seeing him as a means to an end. This was a setup. "I haven't done anything," Leo protested, but the words felt hollow, even to himself. El Silencio just stared, his eyes unwavering. "Your usefulness, it has limits, Leo, especially when you become a liability." He stepped aside, revealing Diablo in the doorway. Cortez standing just behind him, a smug, triumphant look on his face. Diablo's eyes were blazing. "You think you're smart, little man," Diablo growled, his voice a low rumble of thunder. "You think you can play us for fools?" Diablo nodded to Cortez, who grabbed Leo, twisting his arm behind his back with surprising strength. The pain shot through him, a white-hot agony. Diablo stepped closer, his face inches from Leo's. "You went looking for secrets, didn't you? Secrets about this place, about us." Leo tried to deny it, but Diablo cut him off with a vicious backhand across the face. The world tilted, a metallic taste filled his mouth, and a searing pain erupted in his jaw. "El Silencio heard you whispering about old tunnels, about things that aren't meant to be spoken of." Diablo spat, his voice laced with contempt. "He gave you to us." The blows came swiftly, methodically. Cortez held him. Diablo delivered the punishment. They focused on his ribs, his stomach, his legs, avoiding his face for now, prolonging the ordeal. Each impact was a searing wave of pain, forcing the air from his lungs. He crumpled to the floor, gasping, trying to curl into a ball to protect himself. But there was no protection. The physical pain was immense, but the betrayal cut deeper. A cold realization that he was truly alone, utterly expendable. He had trusted, however reluctantly, and that trust had been repaid with brutal violence. As the pain intensified, blurring his vision, the shadows in the room seemed to deepen, to coalesce, a silent, unseen audience enjoying the spectacle of his suffering. A chill, unlike any physical sensation, seeped into his bones, a dark satisfaction radiating from the very walls, claiming another victim, another surge of fear to feed its ancient hunger. This was the first price he paid, not just for his curiosity, but for his brief, fragile attempt at connection in a world that devoured it whole. Leo awoke in a puddle of his own blood and sweat, his body screaming in protest with every shallow breath. He was back in his cell, somehow, dumped unceremoniously, a clear message to anyone who dared to question MS-13's authority. The taste of copper and dust coated his tongue, his jaw throbbed, and his ribs felt like shattered glass. Movement was excruciating, each muscle a knot of agony. He lay there, staring at the concrete ceiling, the faint, sickening hum of the fluorescent lights, a cruel mockery of sanity. The news of his beating spread like wildfire through the blocks. The whispers intensified, not just about his punishment, but about the fragile truce between the gangs. His perceived weakness, his fall from El Silencio's grace, was seen by Barrio 18 as an opportunity. The retaliation was swift. Within hours, a small but strategically important contraband stash belonging to MS-13, hidden in a forgotten utility tunnel, was raided by Barrio 18. Two lower-ranking MS-13 members, caught guarding it, were severely beaten, a clear tit for tat. The prison erupted. What had been a simmering tension now boiled over into open skirmishes. Knives appeared from hidden recesses, makeshift weapons fashioned from anything available. The yard became a battleground, the cafeteria a zone of silent, menacing confrontation. Guards, overwhelmed or perhaps complicit, struggled to maintain order, often only escalating the violence with their heavy-handed interventions. The air became thick with shouts, the clang of metal, the sickening thud of fists against flesh. Leo, a broken man in his cell, heard it all. He heard the cries of pain, the guttural roars of rage. He heard the guards' whistles, the frantic shouts for backup. But he also heard something else, something deeper, more insidious. The whispers, which had once been faint and fleeting, were now omnipresent, weaving themselves into the fabric of the escalating chaos. They weren't just in his mind anymore, they were in the very air. A chorus of ghostly voices, a cacophony of fear and malice. He heard names being called, old names, forgotten names, echoing from the prison's distant past. He heard a low, throbbing sound, like a colossal heart beating deep within the earth beneath the prison, a rhythm that seemed to synchronize with the escalating violence. He felt the cold spots move, no longer static, but flowing like currents through the cell block, carrying with them a palpable sense of hunger. The shadows danced with a life of their own, coiling, twisting, forming fleeting, grotesque shapes in the periphery of his vision. He could sense the entity, feeding, growing stronger, relishing the outpouring of pain and hatred. His beating, his personal torment, had merely been a catalyst, an offering that ignited a larger, more destructive fire. He was not just suffering, he was being consumed, a sacrificial lamb in a war far grander and more terrifying than he could have imagined. The entity was no longer just watching, it was actively participating, its influence seeping into every crack and crevice of CECOT, turning the prison into a living nightmare. Days blurred into a haze of pain and fear. Leo nursed his injuries, slowly regaining some semblance of mobility, but his spirit was further broken. He was an outcast, neither fully MS-13 nor entirely free of their wrath, and certainly not accepted by Barrio 18. He was a ghost in the machine, adrift in the escalating maelstrom of gang warfare. Yet the knowledge he had uncovered, the chilling truths from the old journal, clung to him, a desperate thread of purpose. He knew, with a certainty that transcended logic, that he had to reach that heart chamber, that nexus of the entity's power. It was a suicidal mission, but the alternative, to simply fade away, was equally unappealing. He began to formulate a plan, a desperate, foolhardy scheme. He needed an opening, a diversion, something to draw attention away from the old archival wing. He also needed to regain some trust, even a sliver, to get close enough to the older sections of the prison without being noticed. He thought of El Silencio, the one who had betrayed him, but also the one who had spoken of the spirits. There was a faint hope that El Silencio, despite his ruthlessness, might possess a sliver of understanding, a shared fear of the supernatural. The chance came in the form of a major shakedown announced by Warden Ramirez. The guards, in a show of force, planned to sweep through all the cell blocks, confiscating weapons and contraband and transferring key gang members to solitary confinement. This would create chaos, an opportunity. Leo, using a combination of carefully chosen words and feigned humility, managed to approach a low-ranking MS-13 member named Ray, a quiet man who had shown him a small kindness once, sharing a cigarette. Leo spoke of a deep secret, a vulnerability in Barrio 18's control that only he knew, a piece of intelligence so valuable it could turn the tide. He leveraged the fear of the shakedown, suggesting a preemptive strike against Barrio 18 during the chaos to secure their remaining assets. It was a risky gamble, playing on their desperation. Ray, surprisingly, took the bait, perhaps seeing an opportunity to curry favor with the fractured MS-13 leadership. He relayed Leo's intelligence to Diablo, who, desperate for a win after a series of setbacks, decided to act. The plan was set for the same time as the shakedown, a coordinated assault on Barrio 18's main stash house in the deserted Block D. Leo watched from the sidelines, a grim satisfaction mingled with fear. His plan, his desperate hope, seemed to be working. But the real world of CECOT had a cruel way of delivering its punches. As the shakedown began, sirens blaring, guards shouting, and the prison descending into pandemonium, Leo saw Ray being dragged away by two burly guards. Ray had been identified as one of the key instigators in a recent brawl and was being sent to solitary, effectively severing Leo's only direct link to Diablo. Then, a few minutes later, as the planned Barrio 18 assault was supposed to be unfolding, Leo saw Cortez and Diablo, their faces etched with fury and confusion, being escorted back to their cell block by a group of grinning Barrio 18 members, accompanied by several guards. The intelligence Leo had fabricated had been a trap. Barrio 18, somehow tipped off, had ambushed MS-13. The guards, undoubtedly paid off, had allowed it to happen. Leo's plan had not only failed, but had backfired spectacularly, further entrenching him in the gang's crosshairs and strengthening the guard's control. His desperate hope dissolved into bitter ashes. He was more isolated than ever, his body still healing, his mind reeling from the catastrophic failure. The whispers around him now seemed to mock his efforts, a chorus of dark laughter, and the shadows writhed with a renewed, predatory glee. He had tried to play the game, and the game had played him, leaving him bruised, broken, and alone, utterly adrift in the rising tide of violence and despair. He realized then that his manipulation, his calculated risk, had only served to feed the very entity he sought to escape, its cold, unseen presence now closer than ever. The crushing weight of his failure pressed down on Leo, heavier than any physical blow. He retreated into himself, lying on his bunk, staring at the scarred concrete walls, the prison's sounds fading into a dull roar around him. He felt hollow, empty. The initial adrenaline of survival had long since evaporated, replaced by a profound weariness, a bone-deep exhaustion that seeped into his very soul. He had tried to be smart, to be cunning, but his efforts had only served to exacerbate the chaos, proving him to be an amateur in a world of predators. His mind replayed the events, the beating, the betrayal, his botched plan. He saw Santos's broken face, heard his pained cries, felt the sickening crunch of his own fist connecting. He tasted the metallic tang of his own blood. Each memory was a shard of glass, tearing at his conscience. He had justified his actions as necessary for survival, but now, stripped bare of all illusions, he saw them for what they were: acts of cowardice, complicity in brutality. He was no better than Diablo, no better than El Silencio, no better than the corrupt guards. He had allowed himself to be transformed by the very evil he sought to escape. The cell was dark, the weak overhead lights having flickered out, plunging the block into a deeper gloom. The whispers, no longer mocking, now seemed to emanate from within him, a chorus of accusatory voices echoing his own self-loathing. "Murderer," they hissed. "Coward." He saw the faces of the men he had watched suffer, the pain in their eyes, the fear. He felt the entity's presence stronger than ever, a cold, suffocating weight pressing down on his chest, sucking the air from his lungs. It was reveling in his despair, feeding on his guilt, growing fat on his spiritual desolation. He had believed he was different, that he was merely an unwilling participant. Now he saw the truth. He had made choices, actively, willingly, to survive, and those choices had cost him a piece of his soul. He was trapped, not just by the prison walls, but by his own moral compromises, by the blood on his hands, however indirect. The escape he craved, the freedom, felt utterly unattainable. Not because of the guards, or the gangs, or the entity, but because he no longer recognized the man staring back at him from the mirror of his mind. He was a monster, just like the rest, perhaps even worse, for he had once known better. A profound sense of hopelessness washed over him, a dark night of the soul where no light could penetrate. He wanted to give up, to simply let the prison, the gangs, the entity consume him. There was nothing left to fight for, no one to fight for. His survival no longer held any meaning. The cold, suffocating presence seemed to nod in satisfaction, tightening its grip, claiming him fully. He felt himself sinking, deeper and deeper into the abyss, the absolute rock bottom of his existence, convinced there was no way out, no redemption for the path he had chosen. This was the true cost of CECOT, not just his freedom, but his very essence, devoured by the darkness. The darkness, absolute and suffocating, pressed in on Leo, but something flickered within its depths, a tiny, defiant spark. It was the memory of the journal, the warden's frantic scrawls about the heart chamber, the entity's source. If the prison fed on despair, perhaps fighting back, truly fighting back against the root of the evil, was the only way to reclaim even a shred of his humanity. His guilt remained, a heavy cloak, but it would not be the chain that dragged him down. It would be the fuel for a different kind of war. He couldn't undo his past actions, but he could choose his future ones. He had to get to that chamber, and he couldn't do it alone. He needed an ally, someone who might, against all odds, understand. His mind reluctantly turned to El Silencio. The man was ruthless, a betrayer, but he was also the one who had spoken of the old spirits, the one who possessed an unnerving awareness of the prison's hidden depths. There was a chance, however slim, that El Silencio feared the entity more than he valued gang power, or at least understood its threat. Leo waited for the opportune moment, a brief lull in the constant surveillance. He approached El Silencio in the crowded yard, moving with a newfound, desperate resolve. "I know about the journals," Leo stated, his voice low but firm, cutting straight to the point, bypassing pleasantries, ignoring the risk. "I know about the entity, the heart chamber. It's not just a legend, it's real, and it's feeding on everything here, on all of us." El Silencio's eyes narrowed, a flicker of surprise, Then something else, something akin to grudging respect, or perhaps fear. He looked around, making sure no one was listening, then led Leo to a more secluded corner. "You speak dangerous words, muchacho," El Silencio rasped, his usual calm facade cracking slightly. "Words that can get you killed faster than a shank." "I'm already dead," Leo countered, his voice devoid of emotion. "But the entity, it's devouring more than just our lives. It's devouring our souls, turning this place into its personal feeding ground. It grew stronger after the last riot, after my beating, after everything. Can't you feel it?" He spoke of the increasing cold spots, the intensified whispers, the palpable sense of dread that now permeated every corner of CECOT. He even mentioned the scratching from his cell wall, the rhythmic, unsettling pattern. El Silencio listened, his eyes unblinking. A slow nod. "I always knew there was something here," he admitted, his voice barely a whisper. "Something ancient, something that thrives on our hate." He paused, his gaze fixed on some distant point, his face etched with a rare, genuine apprehension. "It's not just about MS-13 or Barrio anymore, is it? This thing, it controls everything, even Warden Ramirez, even the guards. It wants the chaos." "Exactly," Leo pressed, seizing the moment. "We fight each other, we feed it. We have to stop it. We have to reach the heart chamber, whatever it is. Find a way to sever its hold." El Silencio considered him, a long, searching gaze. The risks were immense, the odds impossible. But a flicker of shared desperation, a common enemy, seemed to bridge the chasm between them. The entity's power was growing, its presence undeniable. "How?" El Silencio finally asked, his voice low, a reluctant acceptance in his tone. "How do we fight a ghost that lives in the walls?" Leo took a deep breath. "I don't know yet, but I have a new purpose now, and so do you, whether you like it or not. We have to change the game entirely. We have to make the prison fight itself." The air around them seemed to momentarily thin, as if the entity had sensed their shift in allegiance, their new, dangerous objective, a direct challenge to its dominion. This was not a fight for survival. It was a war for their very humanity, a war for the soul of CECOT. The fragile alliance forged between Leo and El Silencio was a desperate gambit, a pact born of mutual fear for a common, unseen enemy. Their objective was clear: reach the heart chamber deep within the prison's forgotten tunnels and somehow confront the entity. The plan, however, was still amorphous, a series of calculated risks. They needed a diversion, a large enough disturbance to draw the guards and the gangs away from the old archival wing, but also subtle enough to allow them to slip through unnoticed. The opportunity presented itself during the evening meal service, a time of maximum congregation and minimal guard presence in certain areas. El Silencio, using his intricate network, orchestrated a coordinated but seemingly random brawl between a few low-ranking MS-13 and Barrio 18 members in the main yard, far from their target. It was designed to escalate, to draw the attention of the few patrolling guards and create an opening. As pandemonium erupted in the yard, shouting and the clang of metal echoing through the prison, Leo and El Silencio slipped into the old storage closet. Leo, with El Silencio's surprisingly nimble assistance, quickly worked the rusty lock. The passage opened, revealing the crumbling staircase and the descent into absolute darkness. The journey through the forgotten archives was harrowing. The air grew progressively colder, heavier, filled with a palpable sense of menace. The whispers were no longer just in their minds. They were a distinct, multi-layered chorus, a cacophony of ancient voices speaking in a language both unknown and deeply unsettling. The shadows writhed around them, forming grotesque, fleeting shapes, like tormented souls trying to break free. Finally, guided by the crude map from the journal, They reached it, the heart chamber. It was not a chamber in the traditional sense, but a vast subterranean cavern, roughly hewn from the living rock, its ceiling locked in the gloom. In the center, a gigantic, jagged fissure split the floor, from which a sickly green light pulsed with a slow, rhythmic beat, like a colossal, festering wound. The air here was thick, almost viscous, laden with the stench of decay and raw power. The whispers here were deafening, a chorus of agony and malice, directly targeting their minds, trying to break their will. "This is it," Leo gasped, his voice barely a whisper against the psychic assault. "The source!" Suddenly, the green light intensified, surging outwards, and from the fissure, a form began to coalesce. It was not a solid, corporeal being, but a swirling mass of shadow and raw energy, a vortex of pure malevolence, with eyes of burning emerald fire that fixed directly on them. It was ancient, terrifying, and vast, its presence suffocating. The entity was not merely a spirit, it was a primal force, a manifestation of all the pain and suffering that had ever occurred within CECOT's walls, amplified 1,000-fold. El Silencio, for the first time, showed genuine terror. "It's stronger than I imagined," he choked out, clutching a makeshift shiv, a pathetic weapon against such a foe. "It feeds on fear, on hatred." Leo remembered the journal, the failed rituals. He also remembered his own journey, his own guilt. "It feeds on despair," he corrected, his voice finding a surprising strength. "It feeds on our willingness to be monsters." He knew a physical attack was useless. This wasn't a fight of flesh and blood. "We can't kill it," Leo yelled, his voice echoing in the cavern. "But we can starve it. We can deny it." He looked at El Silencio. The warden, the guards, the gangs, they're all its puppets. If we remove the chaos, the constant violence, it weakens. He thought of the past few days, the escalating gang war. "We have to break the cycle. We have to make peace." El Silencio stared at him, aghast. "Peace? Here? You're insane." But as the entity solidified further, its shadowy tendrils reaching out, grasping at their minds, El Silencio saw the truth in Leo's desperate plan. It was not about winning, but about refusing to lose their humanity. It was an act of defiance against the very nature of the prison. The entity pulsed with rage, sensing their intent, its whispers turning into a deafening roar, shaking the very foundations of the cavern. It manifested images in their minds, their worst fears, their darkest deeds, trying to drive them to madness, to destroy their resolve, to feed on their terror. Leo saw Santos's broken face, heard his cries, felt the blood on his hands. He recoiled, but then pushed back, a grim determination hardening his features. He wouldn't give it the satisfaction. He would deny it. This was the final battle, not against a gang, not against a corrupt system, but against the insidious darkness itself, a choice between becoming its prey or reclaiming a sliver of light in its suffocating grasp. The rules of engagement had been rewritten, the supernatural bearing its full, terrifying might, but also revealing its deepest vulnerability. The entity's spectral tendrils clawed at Leo's Mintu's mind, dredging up every act of complicity, every moment of fear and hatred he had ever felt. Santos's face contorted in agony, his own fist a bloody blur against the young man's jaw. He was a monster, the voices shrieked, a willing participant in the prison's vile game. He almost buckled, the raw power of the malevolence threatening to overwhelm him, to drag him into the green-lit fissure. But then, a surge of defiance, born not of anger, but of a quiet, desperate resolve. He had faced the abyss of his own soul, and he would not give the entity the satisfaction of his complete surrender. He would deny it. He met its burning gaze, not with hatred, but with a stark, unwavering refusal. He imagined a wall, a shield of indifference, pushing back against the psychic onslaught, refusing to feed its hunger with his despair. El Silencio, meanwhile, was fighting his own battle. His face was contorted, his hands clenched, his body shaking under the assault. Leo saw visions of ruthless ambition, of cold-blooded murder, of a lifetime of calculated cruelty. But then, a subtle shift. El Silencio, too, began to push back, his usual calm returning in a fierce, internal struggle. He knew the entity. He had spoken of it. Now he faced it, recognizing its destructive nature, understanding that its victory meant the absolute, meaningless end for all of them. Gang or no gang, the entity shrieked, a soundless scream that vibrated through their very bones. It lashed out, its shadowy form surging towards them, a wave of concentrated malice. But Leo and El Silencio stood firm, their combined wills, however fragile, a barrier against its power. They were not fighting it physically, they were fighting it spiritually, denying it the very nourishment it craved, the despair, the fear, the hatred. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the entity began to recede, its fiery eyes dimming, its form becoming less distinct, less solid. The green light from the fissure flickered, lessening in intensity. The whispers, though still present, became less coherent, less targeted, dissolving back into the ambient gloom. It was not vanquished, not destroyed, but it was weakened, starved by their defiance. Exhausted, trembling, Leo and El Silencio stumbled back through the labyrinthine tunnels. The journey back felt different. The air was still cold, the shadows still long, but the oppressive, suffocating weight was lessened. The whispers were distant echoes, no longer a direct assault. They had faced the unspeakable, and though they bore no physical scars from that particular battle, the internal marks were indelible. Leo emerged from the tunnels a changed man. The bitterness and self-loathing still lingered, a phantom limb of his past, but they no longer consumed him. He understood now that true survival was not just about staying alive, but about preserving his humanity, about choosing not to be a monster, even in a place that demanded it. He would carry the weight of his past actions, the guilt, the memory of Santos, but he would not let them define him. He would not feed the entity. El Silencio, too, was altered. His usual stoicism was replaced by a more reflective, almost haunted air. He looked at Leo with a new understanding, a tacit acknowledgement of their shared, terrifying experience. Their alliance was not one of friendship, but of a grim, mutual respect, forged in the face of an existential threat. The gang war still raged, the guards still oppressed, but a fundamental shift had occurred within them. They had chosen a different path, a silent, internal rebellion against the very essence of CECOT. The prison remained a hell, but they had found a small, fiercely protected pocket of defiance within its grasp. The world outside the heart chamber was still dangerous, still violent, but now Leo had a different kind of armor, a resolve tempered by supernatural horror and profound personal reckoning. Life within CECOT did not magically transform into an idol. The gangs still clashed, the guards still wielded their arbitrary power, and the concrete still bled heat. But for Leo, and perhaps for El Silencio, the landscape had fundamentally shifted. The core of the entity's power had been denied, not destroyed. Its presence was still a palpable undercurrent, a faint chill, a distant whisper, but it no longer dominated, no longer suffocated. It was a weakened beast, still dangerous, but no longer the unchallenged king of despair. Leo moved through the prison with a quiet purpose. He avoided unnecessary conflicts, but he also refused to be a victim. His previous attempts at manipulation had backfired, but his new resolve was different. He spoke less, observed more, his eyes seeing beyond the immediate violence to the deeper, systemic causes of the prison's suffering. He began to subtly, patiently advocate for de-escalation, not through grand speeches, but through quiet words, through discouraging unnecessary acts of aggression, through encouraging small, almost imperceptible acts of defiance against the cycle of hatred. He recognized that true peace was a long, arduous journey, not a sudden revelation. He and El Silencio maintained their silent pact. They did not become friends, that was impossible in CECOT, but they shared an unspoken understanding, a bond forged in the face of the unspeakable. El Silencio, while still leading MS-13 with his characteristic ruthlessness, began to temper some of his more extreme decisions, seemingly understanding that unchecked violence only fed the lingering darkness. He redirected some of the gang's focus from outright war to internal organization, to finding ways to survive the prison's hardships without constantly escalating the bloodshed. This was a fragile, uneasy truce within MS-13 itself, a subtle shift that went unnoticed by most, but held profound implications for the overall dynamics of the prison. The cost for Leo was immense. He would forever carry the memories of his forced complicity, the weight of the violence he had witnessed and, in some small part, participated in. The man who entered CECOT was gone, replaced by someone scarred, hardened, yet strangely resilient. He understood the depths of human cruelty and the insidious nature of true evil, but he also understood the power of choice, the quiet strength in refusing to surrender to despair, in choosing, however incrementally, a path of greater humanity. His time in CECOT was far from over. His sentence stretched before him, an endless expanse of concrete and steel. But he no longer looked at it with the same absolute dread. He had found a new kind of freedom within the confines of his incarceration, a spiritual liberation from the chains of fear and hatred. He was still a prisoner, but he was no longer just a victim. He was a survivor, not just of the gangs and the guards, but of the ancient malevolent force that haunted CECOT's depths. His journey had been one of terrifying discovery, profound personal transformation, and a silent, ongoing war against the darkness that lurked beneath the prison's very foundations. A war he would continue to fight, day by day, breath by breath, in the hope of carving out a future, however small, for himself, and perhaps for the tortured soul of CECOT. The lingering cold spots and faint whispers would serve as a constant reminder, but also as a testament to his enduring defiance.